The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
On behalf of RBCS and software test professionals, welcome to this webinar on advanced software testing, solving test puzzles with policies, strategies, and plans. I am Rex Black. I'm the president of RBCS. We're a worldwide testing and quality assurance firm. We serve clients that range from small startups to Fortune 20 global enterprises. Been around since 1994, delivering insight and confidence to hundreds of clients around the world. Our team of international consultants deliver customized training, consulting, and outsourcing services for companies that are looking to improve their test and quality assurance practices. I am the author of 10 books on software testing, and I won't bore you with all the titles, but one is the bestseller, Managing the Testing Process, and also new ebooks, including Testing Metrics, Measuring Product, Process, and Project Quality. We are presenting this webinar in partnership with Software Test Professionals, so check out their website, www.softwaretestpro.com. Attending today's webinar can get you credits for QAI and ASQ recertification, so if you are looking for that, make sure you check with them. Make sure you understand how to qualify. At the very least, you'll probably need to save the attendee email that you'll receive after this webinar as proof that you did attend. Pardon me. Attendance will definitely get you PMI PDUs as well. Thank you to Mike Lindhorst for reviewing the materials and making valuable suggestions. You can visit www.pmi.org to claim the PDUs using code ASTTP100. Our provider ID is 2986. That information will be in the attendee email that you will receive, so you do not need to ask for it to be repeated. Please note that PDUs are available for live webinar attendance only. No recorded webinar can be used to gain the PDUs. So before we start, some housekeeping notes. If you have any questions, submit them at any time via your webinar interface, but please do note that I will only look at them at the very end of the presentation when we get into the half-hour Q&A session. You do not need to ask for copies of the presentation. The presentation is already on the web. It's at rbcs-us.com. Navigate to the Resources tab in the upper middle of that page, and then from there navigate to the Basic Library page, and you will then find the slides on that page. Also, you were registered to the free e-learning drawing that will happen by attending, so check your email over the next couple days. You might be the lucky winner. If you're having any problems, audio or visual problems, please contact GoToWebinar support. Generally, these problems come down to issues of browser compatibility, not working properly with GoToWebinar. Company firewalls, which is a harder problem to solve. You have to make sure your company security policy allows for connecting to GoToWebinar. Sometimes it's audio settings on your PC, so if you're hearing strange audio or very muted audio, try the audio settings on your PC. I hope you enjoy this free webinar. We do these as a service to the software testing community because at RBCS we are a not-just-for-profit company. Today we are going to talk about test policies, test strategies, and plans, and how we can use those to solve testing puzzles. See the rather amusing illustration here of the six-step process for solving a Rubik's Cube, hitting it with a hammer. Hopefully we can do something a little less brute force than that. This is part of a larger series of advanced software testing webinars drawn from this particular one drawn from my book Advanced Software Testing Volume 2 and Managing the Testing Process 3rd edition. So test policy, strategies, and plans are ways to solve your Rubik's Cube without hitting it with a hammer. A more elegant way of getting to a solution of how your testing should proceed. So we'll look at these. Let's start with what is a test policy. Now this word, you say policy, and people go, oh God, policy. So something that's going to be written down is totally disconnected from day-to-day reality. But what I'm talking about here is a really useful, short, lightweight document that is going to give you the why you test. Why does your organization test? What are you trying to accomplish? What are the objectives of the organization for its testing? testing works well, what happens? What gets done? How do we recognize success? Now, test policy is something that should be developed by reaching consensus between test managers or directors, senior level test management, together with the managers of the various stakeholder groups that work with testing and that rely on the results of testing, both business and technical stakeholders. So we want to talk about our objectives. What are the objectives? How are we going to measure whether we're effectively and efficiently meeting those objectives? What does the process look like at a high level? How do we improve the process over time? What business value do we deliver to the organization? All those things should be clearly and succinctly stated in your test policy. Here you see an example of a test policy from one of our clients. We helped put this together. So we have a short mission statement there, a brief, anonymized description of the way that risk-based testing strategy is followed by the organization, and then some information about the different levels of testing: unit test, integration test, system test, and acceptance test, the owner, the groups that own those, the objectives, and the types of testing that are performed. So as you can see, this is kind of testing in a nutshell. Now there's actually a second page to this document, but it's about half the length of this one, and it's just very high level. This is what we do and why we do it. So if you can't reach consensus on this, you really can't succeed, because that means that people don't agree on what you do and how you go about doing it and how that relates to other things. So far from being sort of a bureaucratic, insignificant exercise in generating paper, really setting the policy is all about making sure that we the testing and its stakeholders agree on what we're trying to accomplish. And since testing exists to provide a service to the broader organization, getting to this agreement is really important. Again, to reiterate, if we can't agree on what a successful testing organization looks like, then certainly in the eyes of some of the stakeholders, your testing organization is failing, or at least not doing what it should. And that can be a very dangerous situation to be in, especially if you get into any sort of budget crunch or economic downturn situation, because the business value of what you're doing is not recognized. Then you would not expect that you would be able to retain resources. So policies are definitely a very important thing to have. And really even more so than the policy itself is the conversations that happen leading up to the creation and approval of a policy that everybody agrees on. And here's, you see the next page of that policy, even more, less verbiage, if you will. We've got a basic illustration of the testing process here, and then description of the key process indicators that are used to measure how well the testing is being done at each of the levels. Okay, so we have established policy. We've said this is what we want to accomplish. Ideally, of course, the policy will be in place before the test group was set up, but in many cases, test groups are set up as just sort of a general, we have pain in terms of quality, so we need to have a test group. And so if that's the case, then you want to get that policy in place to try to build that consensus. Now, policy is different than the strategy. So the strategy, your test strategy, is basically how you're going to go about achieving the policy in a general sense, not on a project-by-project basis, but just in general, how does your test team work? So it should address things like, how do you deal with quality or product risks? You use risk-based testing to address those. So how does risk-based testing work? What is your implementation for that? Who participates? Not who necessarily by name, but who by role. How do you deal with project risks, test-related project risks? What's your general approach to mitigating those risks, or putting contingency plans in place? How do you go about that? For each of the test levels that will be carried out, unit test, integration test, system test, acceptance test, system integration test, whatever the test levels are in your organization, what are the entry and exit criteria for those test levels? What is each level expected to cover? How do you measure coverage? What are the coverage criteria? Typically, in say a system test level, you'd look at things like risk coverage, requirements coverage, configuration coverage, data coverage, those sort of things. Whereas at a unit test level, you might be looking at code coverage. So, get to an agreement on how we're going to determine what constitutes adequate testing at each level. How do we report bugs? How do we track tests? What tools do we use? All of those sort of things are things that can go into a test strategy document. Now, there are different types of strategies, and I actually addressed this in a previous webinar, so I don't want to go through this in detail. I would refer you to the digital library. So if you go to rbcs-us.com and navigate to the resources tab in the upper middle, and then you can that's going to pull down a menu, and you can navigate from there to the digital library, and you can find my recorded webinar on testing strategies. Look at the different types of strategies, and these different strategies can be blended together, should be blended together to try to deal with the vagaries and differences and priorities of your particular organization, your application, the life cycle that you're following, type of risks you're dealing with, any sort of regulatory requirements, where what you do for new product development and what you do for maintenance, that should be taken into account. And of course, the strategy should align with the policy. The strategy should be written in such a way that it's going to enable the achievement of the objectives that were set out in the policy, and should follow the much more general concepts, I guess, that were introduced at the policy level. It fleshes them out. So certainly there should be a perfect alignment there between the policy and the strategy, and effectively traceability of the strategy back to the policy and from the policy to the strategy, so that if anybody's looking at the policy and says, how do you do that? I see that you've got this objective. How do you do that? How do you know that you're achieving that objective? You can actually point to parts of the strategy that talk about how that's going to be carried out. Now, other things that you might address in a strategy document, how does integration work? If you're in charge of doing component integration or system integration, how does that work? Either top down, bottom up, backbone, neighborhood. There's various integration approaches out there, so talk about the ones you use, and if there are multiple ones, how do you select one on a particular project? How are the tests going to be specified? What degree of documentation is going to be kept? What constitutes a properly documented test case? What constitutes independence of the test team? How is that ensured for those test levels that are done by entities that would not be independent? How is that dealt with, or is that simply accepted? If there are any sort of standards that are being followed, there should be a discussion about how those standards are to be put in place, direction given to location of templates and such that might be called for by the standards. How is confirmation testing done? So when you get a defect fix back from development, how do you do confirmation testing? What's the general process for that? What happens to the defect after the confirmation test is over and the confirmation test passed? What happens to the defect report, that is. What happens to the defect report if the confirmation test fails? What do you do? What's the proper thing to do? What happens if you see a new defect while you're running a confirmation test? Regression testing. How is regression testing carried out? Do you use automation? Is it done manually? If there's automation, is there data that goes with that? How does that data get loaded? What tools are used? How do you go about reusing various work products? If there's data is created, how does it get archived? Where are those various repositories in which reusable test work products are stored, and how would one go about finding that? If they're going to be modified, how's change control work there? Is there a configuration management process? How does it work? What are your test environments? How are they set up? Who supports them? If you have a problem with the test environment, who do you go to? As I mentioned before, what tools do you use? How is test control done? In other words, how does the test manager or director of testing make sure that the project testing effort is constantly pointed in a direction that maximizes the effectiveness and efficiency and achieves the objectives set out in the policy? How are results reported? What metrics are gathered? And not just product and project metrics for results reporting, but also process metrics. How do we ensure that we're gathering the proper process metrics? How do we manage defects throughout the life cycle? Was there a bug triage committee? Who's on that committee? Again, by role rather than name. What general roles and responsibilities are there inside the testing team, and what roles and responsibilities are there outside the testing team that interact with testing? For example, who's responsible for delivering builds for testing? And again, roles, not individual names. So the idea here is to describe in general what goes on testing. Now you may say, and this seems like an awful lot of documentation, and isn't this going to all be in the test plan anyway? Now this is one of the beauties of a properly created test strategy, is by explaining things generally in the test strategy, and this thing can be a document or it can be a wiki or an intranet page or what have you. It doesn't have to be necessarily a Word document, but by describing all of this stuff, all of these activities and how they're carried out, so forth, in a strategy document, they don't have to be in the plan. All you have to do in the test plan is say, refer to section X of the test strategy. Now, to the extent that the test plan requires that you provide further details for something that's in the strategy, of course you would need to do that. So, when you're talking about roles and responsibilities, you're talking generally speaking, by title, basically. In a strategy on a particular project, you would actually name somebody. But in the strategy, we're going to try to say, as much to the extent that we can, this is how we do what we do in a project-independent way. Again, a very useful document that can actually reduce the overall amount of time that's spent creating documents, because it reduces the need for extensive test plans associated with each project. So here's an example of part of a test strategy document here. Now, this organization used risk-based testing, and they had they would have an overall assessment of risk for particular functional areas, and you can see that would go from very high to very low. And then they had what they defined as approaches. There's the platinum approach, the gold approach, the silver approach, the lead approach, and the mercury approach. And you see, you select the approach based on the level of risk. So the entry criteria vary. They're very rigorous with the platinum approach, down to there's no entry criteria at all. And the mercury, because the mercury, there's not going to be any testing. We have the coverage, the degree of coverage that we're going to achieve in terms of mission critical. That's MC. mission critical is going to get extensive coverage, and there was a separate definition of what extensive coverage meant. Non-mission critical would get broad coverage. Regression testing would be automated. This is the case of Platinum. You can see that the amount of testing goes down as we get down into the lower approaches there. And then we have our exit criteria that are associated. And again, these are general. They're going to be made specific in the plan. And then we say, what's the residual level of risk? Let me get a spotlight out here. We got the residual level of risk that's left at the end of the process based on the application of that particular approach. And then in some cases, you know, there's the approach that you would want to carry out and the approach that you actually can carry out because of time constraints. So what we see here is we've got a table that says, okay, these different levels of initial risk, if you select, you know, which approach, you know, what's the residual level of risk at the end of applying that approach. So, for example, if we apply the lead approach to something that started off very high, you notice that this is you know, totally discretionary in terms of variation from, you know, the good practices, software engineering practices, and you know, unit testing might or might not have happened, the reviews might or might not have happened, and we're just going to do opportunistic testing of the mission critical software, not going to do any regression testing or testing of non-mission critical software. So, you know, not a lot of coverage, not a lot of confidence that things are going to work properly, and quality would be fairly low. So, you know, if we apply the lead approach to something that's very high risk, you can expect that at the end of that, it's going to, you know, be still fairly high risk. But if you're under time pressure, you might, you know, recommended approach might be Platinum, but you might actually settle for gold or silver because of the time. So the strategy helps us visualize and discuss with stakeholders, again, the trade-offs that are inherent in trading off schedule versus testing coverage. It's like, well, what does that mean? And it's important that that be explicit, and that the test manager can make that explicit, because, you know, when the residual level of risk is unclear to people, it's associated with a particular amount of testing. I mean, they want testing. Most people want testing, but you know, how much of it do they need, and what specifically does it get them? In these two slides, which you've seen, is a way of making that that which is quite often invisible to people visible as part of your strategy. So that's, again, very nice. It's a communication tool, both within the testing team about how we go about carrying things out, and also to people outside the testing team about, you know, what does that mean for me? What does that mean for the stakeholders? Okay, so the strategy was general. Now the test plan is going to be specific. So we're going to have a test plan that is going to say, how exactly are we going to implement the strategy on this project? And like with writing a strategy, this is going to help us think through how we're going to go about doing things, and also serve as a communication tool. We'll communicate with the other participants on the project about, you know, what are we going to do. Now, in some cases you'll have a single plan. In some cases you will have multiple plans. It depends on you know, different groups that own different levels of testing. You'd expect that the different groups might very well have plans. In which case you need some way of coordinating those together. So sometimes you have what's called a master test plan, which describes testing in general, regardless of level, and then things that are level specific will be discussed in the test plans for that level. So unit testing might talk about what specific tool is going to be used to measure code coverage, whereas a system test plan might talk about the tool that's going to be used to measure requirements and risk coverage and so forth. Now, one thing that's true of these plans, as well as of the strategy and the policy documents, is that it's very useful to use these as a communication tool, circulate drafts, get people talking about them, make sure that you're on the right track with these things. You don't want to just go off into your office and create a strategy document, come out and say, oh, behold the strategy, or create a plan and come out and say, hey, here's the plan, this is great. And people might say, well, no, it's not so great, it's actually not going to work. And remember, part of the value here is as a communication tool, so we want to make sure that we're using this to effectively communicate to people. Now, what kind of things go in a test plan? Well, certainly you want to make specific how the strategy is going to be carried out, so you want to define anything that is described in a general sense in the strategy. You want to then say, no, specifically this is how it's going to be done. In addition, you want to talk about what's to be tested and what's not to be tested. What items will be delivered to you? What items might be created as part of the project and you're not going to test? Maybe you don't test documentation, for example. So you say you're going to test the software, but not the documentation. So that might be an example of what's tested and what's not. Also, what's in scope and out of scope in terms of the quality characteristics that you'll test. Are you going to test performance? Are you going to test reliability? Are you going to test usability? Most of the time, functionality is sort of a given, right? But what other characteristics, quality characteristics, are going to be covered and what are not, just so that everybody's clear about, this is what we're going to do and this is what we're not going to do. Establishing the relationship among the levels, if that hasn't already been done in the test strategy. If it has been done in the test strategy, but it's going to be a little different for the test plan, then you need to make sure that that's the case. How do you coordinate the scope across the different levels? That's something that needs to be addressed. How do we make sure that the right things have been covered at each level? What is our schedule? What are the major milestones? What's the budget? That might be in a separate spreadsheet, but it's still part of the plan. How are we doing our test execution, and how does that relate to delivery of test releases from the software release plan? That all needs to be defined. The different stakeholders and participants, how are they going to relate to testing? What do they deliver to us? What do we deliver to them? Making specific the entry criteria, the exit criteria. Also, I like to have continuation criteria, which says these are the things that need to be true for us to be able to continue to test. Specific ownership of the test levels. In other words, this is actually down to names. Before it was titles, roles. Now it will be names. What are the handoffs that happen from one test level to the next, and how do those get carried out? Any sort of test-related project risks that might exist should be identified in the test plan, as well as how you're going to mitigate those risks and contingency plans that you'll have in place in case, in spite of your attempts to mitigate, those risks become undesirable outcomes. And do try to be specific about the risks. I saw a test plan last year when I was doing an assessment, and it was just the most generic statements were made about risks and how one might go about addressing those. And it was clear that there was no real way that would translate into actual risk management in the event. That it was written down, it was in there because someone knew it needed to be in there, but it just was not actionable. So, test plans need to be actionable, the whole thing, especially the how you're going to manage the test-related project risks. And then finally, the test plan should also address the issue of governance, of decision-making. What is the individual tester empowered to do? What does the test manager decide? What gets decided by bug triage committees? How does the test manager report to project managers or product managers? There's a director of testing. How does the manager of the testing on a given project report up to the director? All these sort of things. And again, some of this stuff might be migrated up into the test strategy and dealt with there. The more you can move content up into a test strategy, the better, less documentation you'll need. Now, of course, what needs to be true to be able to move stuff into a test strategy is you need to do things the same way from one project to the next. Here's an example of the work product flow diagram from a test plan. We had, as you can see, a number of different teams involved in this particular project, and it's been somewhat anonymized here, but based on a real project. And there's a lot of stuff flowing back and forth. So what we've done is drawn a diagram that shows how the different groups relate to each other and how the different work products flow back and forth between the groups on this project, just to help make that relationship clear. Another thing that can be helpful is a diagram like this, an organizational setting diagram. And this diagram is going to show us how the different groups relate to each other and who gives what to whom. So, let me kind of walk through this a little bit here. Spotlight out. You see that the senior and executive management provides support and resources and, as needed, course correction to the test team. We, the test team, provide test estimates and plans, as well as test result reports up to senior management. Senior management provides direction to the development team in terms of bug fix prioritization. And the development team provides source releases to the release engineering team, which then provides actual test releases to us. You can see also we have workarounds, release notes, unit test results coming from the development team. We provide bug reports, and we might also provide unit tests to the development team. So we have an indirect relationship as well as having direct relationships. Tech support, providing customer use cases and user data to us. We're going to provide detailed test results to them. They define what the user environments look like. System operations people set those environments up for us and support them. So, showing this document to these different participants and stakeholders while we're creating the plan, you show them this diagram, and then it's possible to have a conversation about, oh yeah, okay, I didn't realize that you needed that from me. All right, good. Oh, God, when do you need it? It really allows you to kind of clarify that relationship, and without that clarification, you can often find situations where you go to somebody at the beginning of a test execution period and you say, hey, I'm ready for the first test release, and I remember one client told me a story about test manager went to the development manager and said, yeah, I'm ready for my first test release, and the development manager said, okay, well, the source code is on that system over there. We'll get you a login to the source code control system, and then you can just produce a build and install it in your test environment. And the test manager looked at him and said, well, I don't have anybody in my team that knows how to do that. The development manager says, well, I don't have anybody in my team that has spare time to do it for you, so you're going to have to figure it out. So, this is a kind of rude surprise, obviously greatly interfered with the ability to carry out testing on the planned schedule, and it was completely avoidable through proper planning. So, again, we can deal with this stuff in a proactive fashion through a plan, or we can kind of get slapped in the face by nasty surprises like that later because we didn't plan. And looking at this document, you can see that this is this diagram, you can see that this is another thing that could probably migrate up into a test strategy document if this is a general pattern of how the test team relates to other groups. Now, entry criteria, again, something that can be specified in general in the strategy. You usually have to have something specific in the plan. So entry criteria would be, are we actually ready to do testing, a particular level of testing. So, do we have all of the information that we need about how the system works, how it's designed, how it's supposed to behave? That information provided, do we have the software itself? Is it ready to be delivered? Is everything else that we need to support test execution available? The tools set up, the test lab set up, is the environment set up? Is there anything else that we need? Hard access keys for testers to be able to get into the test lab? Is the software that's going to be delivered to us at an appropriate level of quality? Has sufficient upfront testing work been done? These are all things that we want to potentially look at prior to starting a particular level of testing. Now, usually at the lower levels, like unit test, the entry criteria are very, very lax. It's only when you get up into more formalized levels like system test and system integration test where you see these getting more formalized. Now, here you see the an example of entry criteria on a particular project. Let me get the spotlighter up and we'll look at some of these. So, do we have the ability to track bugs in our tests? Okay, that's important. Is the software under configuration and release management control? Is the environment properly set up? Do we have access to it? Are all the features done and all the bug fixes done? Now, this is a project following a sequential lifecycle model, so that's a rule there. And have those all been unit tested? From the unit testing, are there less than 50 must-fix bugs found? And we see we have a definition of who gets to define must-fix bugs. Number 7 and 8 provide for a 3-day smoke test opportunity for the test team. Check to see if the product is stable. So by smoke test here, we're talking about sort of a basic functionality test that spans all of the major functional areas of the software and make sure that it is indeed ready to go. And then we complete a phase entry meeting and agree, yes, we should start. Now, a couple things here, one general about this example and one more specific. So in general, you'll notice that the entry criteria tend to reflect the life cycle, so this is sequential. If it were agile, this of course would look different. Now, if we were talking about an agile project, you'd still want to have a plan, a test plan, but the plan would be not per iteration, but the plan would span the different iterations. Basically, each iteration would constitute a separate set of testing activities, but the plan would need to talk about this is how we're going to carry those activities out from one iteration to the next. Now, specifically, back to this example, in the project, what we did is when the development team said, we think we're ready to start system test, we said, okay, great, well, let's have a review meeting. And I went through and I rated every one of these entry criteria as either green, yellow, or red, where green meant it's completely satisfied, no problems here. Yellow was it's not completely satisfied, but we might be able to live with it, and here's how we would live with it. Red was this is definitely not satisfied, and it's going to cause us some significant problems, and here's what those problems are. And so we actually went through that review meeting, and there were a number of red items here, and the decision was made to postpone the start of system testing in response to that. So having these entry criteria well defined and applicable to your particular project can help you stave off premature entry into testing in some circumstances. Now, the exit criteria, have we achieved the objectives that were defined for the testing on this project? And again, the objectives should be defined; they should be in the plan. So, what's the quality of the software, right? That's something that should be addressed by the exit criteria. What's the target for that? How are we judging the completeness of testing? If the exit criteria are not met, it should be something that would allow us to have a good discussion about the various business impacts associated with curtailing testing versus continuing it, right? So what's the residual level of quality risk at this point? What's the path forward if we do curtail the testing? What's the path forward if we continue the testing? And again, we want to make sure that we've got very clear alignment in terms of the objectives that were set out in the test policy, because remember, testing objectives are defined in the test policy. This is what we want to achieve, and the exit criteria are basically going to need to say, this is how we measure whether we've achieved the objectives for this particular project. So you want to be careful to do that. Pardon me. So exit criteria from the same project as before. We have a stable system, nothing new in terms of code, features, etc., except to address actual defects. So we've got the system's been stabilized for at least 3 weeks. 2 and 3 have to do with particular classes of failures that could occur on that particular project that would have been really very dangerous given the nature of the product. So we wanted to make sure that those weren't happening. Have we completed all of the planned tests? Have all of the must-fix bugs been resolved, and the sales, marketing, and customer service folks, who are the triage team, get to make that decision of what's must-fix and is it done? Here's a housekeeping thing for us, test team, making sure that every bug report in the bug tracking system is in one of 2 states. It's either closed or it's deferred. So closed means it is actually fixed. Deferred means it's not going to be fixed. We're not going to do that. And for the ones that were closed, we want to make sure that the appropriate confirmation testing was carried out and the appropriate regression testing was carried out. This is the basically, are we actually done testing? We have number 7 here that's about the what the metrics are telling us, what our project and product metrics say. This is not something that we're going to get into in depth here about results reporting, but this would have to do with reporting of results in terms of are they telling us that the quality is good enough or not good enough? Have we covered enough? So completeness of testing and quality of the system is addressed here. Number 8, I think this is a good general exit criteria. Is one that I would encourage you to look at and think about. It's a simple statement. The project management team agrees that the product, as defined during the final cycle of system test, in other words, what was submitted for the final cycle of system testing, that will satisfy the customer's reasonable expectations of quality. If people can't, if products and project stakeholders can't sit around in a room and agree that this is true, then should we really be releasing? And so one of the things that I'm trying to accomplish with this as an exit criteria is to establish collective moral ownership of the ship decision, right? Because all too often what ends up happening is that, the testing, of course, is not perfect, and something, software gets released, and then there's a bug, and then, people come back and basically say, why didn't you catch that? Which is really just a matter of it's someone saying to the test organization, why didn't you save me from myself? The test organization didn't put the bugs in there, right? So it's I think important to try to get that collective ownership of that release decision, and then people together are saying, yes, we agree this is smart, and we understand that there are still risks, and the testing is not perfect, but we believe it's smart to release anyway. And then number 9 has to do with the having this discussion of the exit criteria in a meeting. And again, on this project, I did the same thing. I rated each one of these exit criteria, green, yellow, red, and we had a meeting, and there was a lot of red, and they decided they weren't going to ship, and then we had another meeting, couple weeks later, and there was still some red, and we decided that we weren't going to ship. We were going to continue to test, and then finally we had a meeting, and there was still a little bit of red, and I gave my spiel about what the results were and why we thought that the quality wasn't good enough. And senior executive who was in the meeting said, well, I hear you, I understand you, that's good and useful information, but we are going to go ahead and release anyway. And I said, well, that's certainly your call. Can you tell me why you think we need to do that now? And he said, well, the venture capitalists who are funding our company tell us that we have to have revenue this year or else they're going to shut us down. At the very least, get rid of management, put in a new team, and in order for us to realize revenue, because this is a consumer product, we have to have it available for the Christmas sales season, and here we are, we're the first week of November, and the only way to actually have this thing done and available by the Christmas sales season is for us to conclude all of the testing this week and release the software for production so we can start getting it on the devices and getting it out there for people to have. And, this is the better a live dog than a dead lion argument, which pretty much wins every time. And, of course, I said that sounds like an extremely prudent and reasonable business decision, as long as you understand that there are some quality issues, and those will be encountered by the customers. And he said, yes, we understand. It's not perfect. We're not where we would want to be with the quality, but I think we're good enough with the quality that we're going to go ahead and go live. So that's what I meant in the earlier slide about facilitating an intelligent business discussion about, what are the pros and cons of adhering to or relaxing the criteria. Now, another thing that should be addressed specifically in the test plan, this will probably also be addressed generally in the strategy, but we need to be specific about this in the test plan, is this issue of how test releases are given to the product team. How do we actually get software to test? Because in the absence of this, you can get into that situation that I described earlier, where the test manager goes and asks for a test release and is told, well, there's the source code over there, knock yourself out. So we want to define things like, how often are we going to get releases? So, if you're in an agile world, you might very well be taking a release every morning based on a continuous integration system that runs and produces a build overnight, runs automated tests against it. You might take builds once a week if you're in a more sequential type of life cycle. Hopefully, though, it's not just like any time someone feels like giving me something, which in the absence of some definition of this, it can definitely devolve into that. What's the process for installing a build? What's the process for removing a build if it turns out to be bad? That's something you want to have clearly understood. You need to have a fallback. What happens when we're given a build that's not what we need and it won't work? It's not testable. How are the builds named? Ideally, there's some sort of sequential numbering system, and you're able to determine what build is more recent. Also, that should, of course, map back to the configuration management system, so there should be a way of determining exactly what versions of each file that make up the system were used to produce a particular build, so we don't get this kind of ambiguity about, gee, the developer saying, I don't see that on my software, and, I'm not sure what version it is, so, who knows if this is a problem that we have or not once you try it again. Now, also, it's important that you be able to get at that revision number, be able to interrogate the system and say, what version are you? So that's important. I mean, you don't want to have version numbers that are internal to the system and can't be accessed. I remember once having a conversation with a development manager who said, I said, how do we determine what revision level the software is at? He goes, oh yeah, that's easy. It's a particular location in the software. What you do is you use an octal dump, and you do an octal dump, and you navigate to the hex address. I forget the hex address he gave me. You navigate to that address, and the first 6 bytes at that address give you the revision number. So the first 2 bytes are the major number, and the next 4 bytes are the minor number. And I said, I'm sure that works very well for you and your team. However, that is not going to work for my team because I have non-technical people who do not know how to operate an octal dump in my team. And everybody in my team needs to be able to get a revision number out. So could you please add, this was a command line application, could you please add a command line flag to the application that allows us to simply query what version it is? And he said, oh, okay, yes, we can do that. So you want to make sure that that's worked out if it's not immediately obvious, because you don't want to be filing bug reports and be unable to say what version of the software you were testing. Also, if you're testing complex systems and systems of systems, things that interact with other systems or interact with complex databases and so forth, make sure you've addressed that issue of how those things get synchronized. On one particular project, we were testing a complex system of systems that had an interaction with a table that described the members of this, basically the allowed users for a particular piece of software, and the users, this user table is called the member table, was never really properly defined, and it ended up causing all sorts of problems for us in terms of the software not being able to interact properly with the database. And then make sure that you've got a definition for each step of the process. This is a multi-step process, getting a test release, and you want to make sure that you know who owns which step, because it's a handoff across groups, and if that handoff breaks down, then that's going to create some problems. Now, as I said, make sure that you deal with how you're going to manage risks in your test plan. Basically, for your test-related project risks, things like delay of release of the software, unavailable test environments, those sort of things. Think about the different options you've got. One is, mitigate. You can take preventive actions to mitigate the risk. You can have a contingency plan in place, and usually you want to have a trigger for that. How are we going to recognize that we need to trigger the contingency plan? Transference of the risk, usually not a good idea, but in some cases you can transfer the consequences of a risk onto another party if they accept it, and you can also choose to ignore the risk. Now, make sure that you think about the costs and the additional risks that are potentially associated with a particular approach to managing a risk, as well as the benefits and opportunities of it. Like, so there's a risk associated with transferring the risk. The risk there is that in the event the entity that you're trying to transfer it to will choose not to accept it. Now, let's talk a little bit about life cycles here, because this is very important. You definitely need to make sure that these different documents that I've discussed are compatible with the life cycle you're following. So, obviously the policy, you need to think about life cycle in terms of what the test process is and when you gather certain metrics and so forth. The test strategy has to be very clear about how the testing will be integrated into the life cycle. I mean, a test strategy that would work for a sequential life cycle model will be completely inappropriate for a agile life cycle model. Now, we're talking about test plans. In a sequential life cycle, you're going to have the test plan. You write that just about parallel with the creation of the project plan. You have exit criteria that will clearly define how the how we get to done. You have test activities that have to be clearly aligned with the different activities, the different development activities in the project lifecycle. Now, if you're doing a iterative lifecycle like RUP, which is not Agile, your plan is going to be written during the inception of the project, and then you're going to either revise it or append something to it at the start of each iteration to make sure that it continues to be a good guide. And the same kind of thing would happen in Agile, where the test plan is written at the beginning of a project where there's going to be a sequence of iterations. It describes how the testing is going to occur in each iteration, and then you revise it or possibly put an appendix on it at the start of each iteration to make sure that it's still aligned. So definitely you want to have a different approach to this documentation depending on the life cycle. And a policy, strategy, and plan that would be perfect in the sequential life cycle would definitely be not what you would want in a sequential life cycle or the Agile. Okay, so we looked at policy, strategies, and plans, how we can use those to guide testing, how we can use those to define what we're trying to do, how we're going to do it, work collaboratively with the different stakeholders. We can talk about what it means for us to be successful as testers, what it means to contribute properly to the project, facilitating business decisions about whether the project is on track for success. Now, as I said, it is important that these documents be aligned, that they be consistent with each other. It's also important too that you stay focused on being relevant, being concise, being connected to the realities that you're in. I remember doing an assessment once and looking at a test plan, and it's really described a fairly organized situation that I had been told that the situation was definitely not organized, and so I asked the test manager, so what's up with the test plan? I mean, I was told that there was a lot of chaotic things that go on here in testing, and the test plan looks very organized. And he said, well, we like to think of the test plan as an aspirational document, and this really doesn't make any sense. I mean, it's the policy, the strategy, the plan. They should not really they shouldn't be talking about what you'd like to do in a perfect world. They should talk about what you actually are doing. So make sure that you have that kind of relevance. Okay, so let's open it up for questions here. Let me get the question panel undocked and out here in the wider space here. I had a comment from somebody, Max, saying that there was no sound, but I'm not seeing any problem here at my end, and Max is still here, so I'm assuming that that he did get his sound problem resolved. Ramya asks, relevant to, I believe, this slide here, what is REGR? It has to do with regression. It's the how are we going to approach regression testing? Let's see, a question from Vladimir. Are you recording this session? I would like to download it. Thanks for the information. We are recording it. You can't download it, but you can listen to it on our YouTube channel or on our digital library. Thomas says, great presentation as always. Thank you. Should there be a percentage pass criteria as part of the exit criteria? If so, what is a typically acceptable percentage? Well, I'm really not a big fan of hard coding that stuff into the exit criteria. Especially percentage test case passed, because the percentage of test cases passed or failed is such a it's a number that can have a lot of different meanings depending on which tests have passed, which have failed. I mean, you could be 90% passed, but the 10% that have failed are really important, or they could be really trivial. Also, the size of tests can vary, so test case counts tend to be a pretty bad metric that way. So I'm not a huge fan of that. Now, that's something I will report, as well as reporting things like risk coverage and requirements coverage and how many are pass-fail rates for those. And that's part of the metrics that I would be reporting in the exit meetings, but I would not be hard coding that into the criteria myself. Question from Jay here. Does the test release management reside in the test plan or in the test strategy? Well, let's see. If we're looking at this kind of really generic, go back here, this kind of really generic level of information, we can put that in the strategy, yes. And then what you can do is, if there is project-specific stuff, then discuss that in the plan. But yeah, the general rule is, you're dealing with an ongoing operation, try to migrate as much as you can up into the strategy. Burgess says, so in essence, test strategy is a document that does not, there's a blank here, does not something for a project after being defined, does not, I guess, change for a project after being defined. However, a test plan can change with changes occurring in the test lifecycle. For example, if there are schedule changes. Would it be fair to say that? Yes. The test strategy is a project-independent general way of talking about how we go about testing, while the test plan is project-specific, and thus as the project evolves, the plan needs to evolve with it. But the strategy remains the same. And to the extent that on a particular project we are going to deviate from the strategy, the plan can talk about the deviation from the strategy and how we're going to do that. Jay Fry says a follow-up, it says or test policy. I assume he's talking about the test release management going to test policy. I would not put the test release management in the test policy, because test release management is a how, it's not a why. It's, you test releases enable testing, and so that's something that's it's a how we do something. Paul says test plan is a bad word where I work and not allowed. Well, that's interesting. I don't know why it would be a bad word unless it's connoted with some sort of completely extraneous document that's not connected with reality. But regardless of whether people allow the use of a quote-unquote test plan, surely test planning is something that has to happen. So, the issue I think would be, is there a question of relevance? Is the documents documents that are being produced, are they irrelevant? Partha says, should there be a separate test policy for each phase of testing, like system test, integration test, performance test, load test, etc.? Separate policy or single policy? I would say that there should be a single policy, because what I want to do is tie together the testing, what are we trying to accomplish in general with testing, and then now you could have presumably a separate strategy for each one of those types of testing, but then that introduces the possibility of gaps or overlaps. So I would say that the strategy should be unified as well. Christian says, very instructive, thanks. I will share this presentation with our QA leaders team as part of our improvement schedule. Okay, you will be able to find the recorded version in the next few days, Christian, so you can direct them to our website to take a look at that. Anjali says, how frequently should we update the test plan, strategy, and policy? What procedure should be followed to update these? Well, the plan needs to be updated as needed as the project goes along, and there are various approaches to doing that. You can either actually update the document itself, or you can just use some sort of change log and just log changes. For example, I've used an Access database or an Excel spreadsheet for this to log deviations from the plan as we update it. Kind of depends on what you want to do. The strategy and policy should probably undergo regular reviews. I'd say at least once a year, maybe twice a year, to keep those up to date. Obviously, if during the course of a project they discover that there's something missing from the strategy, then you want to think about adding that to the strategy. Shesha asks, how do we maintain test plans when more than one version of the same code is maintained to satisfy different customer needs? Well, I would think that the plan might be different for the different customers. If you forked the code and you're putting different features in place for the different customers, then yeah, you could potentially have different plans. Might or might not be a generic strategy that would apply there. You would have to try to keep it fairly generic. So I think there are ways to have, to reuse documentation that you'd want to pursue. Vinay, comment, very good and informative presentation on sample exit criteria. Should be noted that all business requirements must be met. If they are not met, then the test lead or a person who's writing the test plan should also mention. That actually, the way that we did that, go back to that example, was here with item 7. Oops. Let me, sorry, I got to deal with some issues. Product stability and reliability, completion of plan tests, adequate coverage of the critical quality risks. We didn't have a really good set of requirements there, so we used risks as our test basis. But yes, if you're doing a requirements-based, if you're following a requirements-based testing strategy, then you could have requirements coverage there as well. Let's see. Let me get this. Just had something odd go on with question panel. Let me fix that. Janice says, can you have a test policy, strategy, and plans without software development policy, strategies, and plans? What happens here can't exist in a vacuum. Yeah, well, that's definitely true, and that's just as a general observation, the maturity of the test process can't be higher than the maturity of the overall software development process, because it puts a constraint in place. You can have those documents in place and try to sort of lead a greater level of maturity for the project, the development team as a whole. But that's something that you need to approach with a lot of caution. Yeah, if you're trying to introduce a lot of structure and maturity into your testing operation and it just doesn't exist for the broader organization, then you're going to be playing an evangelist role in a sense. Gardner says, well done presentation. Quick administration question. What was the PDU code for the PMI? So everybody who attended will be receiving an email, and that's an attendee confirmation email, and that email has the PDU code that you can use for PMI. So you'll get that information over the next couple of days. So just watch for a follow-up email from Citrix that will give you that information. Joseph asks, any advice on providing testing strategy and support through a centralized organization in order to remove or reduce that overhead within the project teams? In other words, standardized practices based upon the type of project. Well, I would say that, if you're basically an internal testing service provider in an organization providing testing services across multiple projects. Standardizing your methodology and strategy is great, and that should definitely help with efficiency. But you also want to make sure that you preserve the flexibility to deviate from the strategy on each project via the test plans to make sure that you have taken project-specific variables into account. So make sure that you do try to balance those different objectives. Ken says, Rex, great mentoring as always. Thank you for that. Do you like to see testing risks maintained in the test plan or the project's risk document? If you have a mature risk management strategy, practice, whatever you want to call it, in place on your projects, and you feel confident that the test-related project risks can be managed effectively within the context of that process, I would say you could go ahead and include a lot of them there. The only thing is that some of those risks, there are some that you might look at and say, it actually would be counterproductive to expose the broader world to the existence of this risk and what we're doing to deal with it. I can't think of any examples right off the top of my head, but just in general, I've found that sometimes exposing people from outside of the testing group to too much of the sort of testing sausage making is not a good plan. Sometimes it can turn into an invitation to jump in and micromanage you, which you definitely want to avoid. So, I'd say yes, generally one could do that, but there might be certain risks that you would prefer to manage on your own off of that list. Entry criteria. So James says entry criteria, you do not mention resource availability. Do you not think this is important enough for the test plan? Oh, yeah, I think that's, if you're in a situation where there are additional resources that are going to need to be provided to you above and beyond the test environment immediately prior to test execution starting, then I would definitely put those in there. Now, if you're in a situation where the entire team and all of the resources other than the test environment are going to be available to you prior to test execution, then that's not an entry criteria for test execution. That's an entry criteria for the larger activity that you're engaged in. Stephanie says, when we put together our policy, we want our strategy to define the main points of our policy, correct? If this is the case, is there a good rule of thumb to ensure that we aren't too vague or in-depth on the strategy? So yes, you want complete alignment between the policy and the strategy. The strategy talks about how to implement the policy. There should be traceability from the policy, the objectives and so forth defined in the policy, down to the strategy and how you're going to carry it out. Now, in terms of the degree of detail that you're going to put in the strategy, well, that's really going to be determined by what can you say generally, and what gets into project specific. You don't want to have so much detail in there that you're trying to describe all the possibilities on every different possible type of project could happen. You want to be general in the strategy document, and if there's variation that's going to happen project by project, that stuff goes in the plan. I would say just any time you spend documenting is time you spend not doing other things, basically, right? It takes away from other activities. So if in doubt, start off with less documentation and add to it as you find you need more, rather than start out with more documentation and then find out, God, this is so much information that it overwhelms people and they don't use it, because you definitely want these documents to be relevant. Question from Maria here, what is the project plan document and who writes it? Well, the project plan is the broader description across the entire project of what's going to go on, might be an umbrella document that encompasses a lot of other documents like the configuration management plan, the test plan, the development plan, release plan, support plan, etc. In terms of who writes it, well, that really varies. It could be a product manager, it could be a project manager, but somebody should own it. Jared asks, as the test plan is more of a living document, is it appropriate to create it as more of a brainstorming tool such as XMind, or is it more important to harden, baseline, and version the artifacts such as PDF? I think this is really going to be organizationally dependent. I can imagine situations where doing something that's just some sort of loose brainstorming tool was not enough structure. And I can also imagine situations where this sort of baselining and versioning and so forth could put in place too much structure. So, I think this one you have to sort of figure out on your own. Is the plan helping us do better testing is ultimately the question. And if the answer is yes, then, you must be doing this appropriately. But if people are saying plan's too slow moving, can't adapt to change, etc., then maybe you've got too much structure around it. So a question here from Rama that starts off John. I'm not sure who John is. John is not me. If your budget is limited and you produce only one document, which one would you recommend, the test strategy or the test plan? Well, I mean, if I'm running a single project, then all I need is a test plan. If it's a one-off project, you don't need a strategy because strategy is project independent, right? Now, if you're doing an ongoing operation, there's going to be a series of projects, and you don't have enough time to write down a test plan for each project. I mean, I'd want to have a test strategy, I guess, but I mean, it's curious because there's going to be planning. So, yeah, it seems kind of a strange trade-off to make. Christian asks, what book would you recommend to improve test plan writing skills? Well, of my books, Advanced Software Testing Volume 2 addresses test plan writing, and Managing the Testing Process address test plan writing. So either of those would be good. I got a question from Steve here. I like the idea of test policy, strategy, plan working together. We often have a problem of getting test plans approved. Doing that for every iteration would not be possible. What do you suggest for approvals? Perhaps different approval levels. Yeah. So going back, you say iteration, so I assume you're talking Agile here. In an Agile world, you would not have a separate plan for each iteration. You have a plan that spans all of the iterations, and what happens is that gets added to or made specific in some way in a very brief addendum for each iteration. So the approval of the test plan is something that would happen in probably with a broader scope at the beginning of the sequence of iterations, and then the approval of the addendum for a particular iteration would be something that would just be, up to the sprint team. Courtney asked a related question here of, after the first round of test plan approvals, do we need to seek approvals every time the test plan is updated? This is going to depend on the way you're set up. Again, if you're following an Agile approach, I would expect that you would get the plan approved in a more broad sense at the beginning prior to the first iteration, and then the specifics of what testing is going to happen exactly for a particular iteration are addressed in an addendum, short, maybe 1 or 2 page addendum that's produced at the beginning of each iteration and is approved by the sprint team. If you're talking about the sequential life cycle model, well, this can depend a lot in terms of how change management is done. Definitely you want to avoid changing the plan without making the appropriate stakeholders aware of it, though. So think about the change that you made and think about how that affects your different testing stakeholders. And you don't want to create a situation where people are surprised later and they point to the test plan and say, hey, in here you said you were going to do this, and how come you didn't do that? And I'm disappointed, and you didn't achieve your objectives. And that, so, change management really is, a lot of it is about preventing surprise. Also, of course, it's about preventing inefficiency and mistakes. But, from the preventing surprise perspective, make sure that you've addressed that issue. Mary asks about getting a copy of the slides. So once again, go to rbcs-us.com, go to the Resources tab in the upper middle, pull down the menu from there, navigate to the Basic Library, and you'll find this presentation at the very end of that page. Let's see. Steve says, who do you suggest approves each artifact? So the test policy, I think this should be approved at a senior management level. You really want to make people aware of what it is you're trying to accomplish. The strategy, that's going to be more like people that are direct participants, stakeholders in individual projects. The people are going to be affected by how you go about doing your work. There might be parts of that document that you show to more senior managers. And then the plans, that again is going to be, participants in the project. Payush asks, great insights, Rex, as always. Thank you for that. Would you like to add user acceptance testing specific tips, strategy, plan, acceptance, etc.? I think user acceptance testing should be addressed in the policy and the strategy. Talk about how that's aligned with the overall set of testing activities that are going on. As far as the plan, it kind of depends on ownership, Piyush. You get in a lot of situations where the acceptance testing is owned by users, and maybe they don't want to write up a specific plan and so forth. So, it can be that maybe there's not a formal acceptance test plan, but the acceptance testing is described in the strategy. Irma says, thank you for a very informative seminar. You are welcome. Concept of a unified test policy and strategy is something that we can definitely streamline the process of creating test plans. Yes, that definitely can help with that. So good luck. Janice asks, what kind of test metrics should one include in the exit criteria? I would not include any specifically. The metric itself is not going to be defined there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to basically reference the test results reporting dashboard that I have. So I would refer you to the presentation that I gave on testing metrics a while ago. There's a recorded webinar on that. And also we now have a virtual workshop class that we're going to be rolling out in 2013. It's a 3-hour class that we will charge for it, but it won't be much. I think it's going to be like $199. And you'll be able to take that if you want, get more thinking about the kinds of metrics that you might want to use. Jared says, what are your thoughts on creating an automated test harness to mock objects that will be delivered to your test team by another test team as pre-acceptance test entry criteria to validate the expected inputs and outputs delivered prior to code drops? Is this a good practice, or is it better to integrate the code and utilize more of an automated black box approach? I like that idea. I like both. I like the idea of having an automated build test that's constructed of automated unit tests, and also ideally some automated integration tests that work through mock objects and so forth at a unit and integration level, and then that being augmented by some sort of black box type of approach using, say, Quick Test Pro or Selenium or something like that. Gene says, thank you, good stuff. You're welcome. Enterprise testing is a new entity in our organization. Any other useful resources of any kind for a new department under new but experienced leadership just getting off the ground? Thanks. Well, I mean, certainly, this is something that I discuss in managing the testing process and in Advanced Software Testing Volume 2. It's about test management. So, I would say take a look at those. Obviously, we've got all of the recorded webinars that you can access on our digital library. And, RBCS also offers training and consulting. So if you would like some more direct help from us in getting things off the ground and training people there, send an email to info@rbcs-us.com, and we'd be happy to get you a quote. Let's see. Running low on time, but I think we got time for one or two questions here. We got a question from Ken. When deciding what time is appropriate for the testing required, what techniques work best with flexibility and relevance to test and project can we use to derive estimates and knowledge? Ken, that's a great question, and I would ask that you hold that thought. We are going to rerun one of our most popular webinars ever, though this one is shaping up to be close to it. We're going to rerun one of our most popular webinars ever on test estimation. I believe that's next month. Watch for the invite, and it will be coming out soon. Maria asks, am I correct that the test policy and strategy are the same for all projects within the organization? Yes, they should be, though if the organization has different branches that do very different things, they might actually be different. So, for example, if I were in an organization like, let's say, Pfizer or something that does, some of the software is safety critical, regulated for medical use, and some of the other software is just like the company website, obviously I would have very different policies and strategies for how I test the safety critical medical software versus how I test information that gets posted on the company website. Rich says, hi Rex, thanks again for this great webinar. You are quite welcome. Can you recommend any good dashboard applications for reporting bug data? Well, if you're asking about tools, Rich, I try not to get into any sort of specific recommendations of tools. And again, if you're asking about specific metrics, check the RBCS website. We've got all sorts of resources there. Talk about metrics, and again, keep your eyes open for the new virtual workshop series that's going to be coming out. Rich follows up, I just purchased your book and I'm looking forward to putting it to good use. Cheers, Rich. Thanks. Hope it does help. So we're out of time, so just want to close this session by letting you know a few more things about the resources available through RBCS. We run these free webinar sessions once a month, so check our website, rbcs-us.com, to sign up. If you'd like a special webinar presentation for your company only of this webinar or on any other topic related to software testing, send an email to info@rbcs-us.com or via our website. If you don't receive our regular free newsletter, sign up at rbcs-us.com. This will get you valuable discounts on consulting and training services, along with the regular newsletter, which will have a featured article on software testing, as well as news about what RBCS and its partners are doing. We're on Twitter. We are at RBCS. We're on Facebook, RBCS-INC. Do remember to check your email over the next couple days. You could be the lucky winner of a free e-learning course. You're registered for that course by simply attending. Check out the blog, rbcs-us.com/blog. Post comments. You can email me if you want to discuss something on the blog. Send the email to info@rbcs-us.com with the word blog in the subject line. You can check out the digital library. We've got recorded webinars, podcasts, and videos where you can get our podcast via iTunes and our RBCS podcast into the search string. You can subscribe to the RBCS channel on YouTube. We post these recorded webinars there as well. So all these are free resources for the software testing community, because at RBCS we are a not just-for-profit company. This concludes the webinar. Thanks to everyone for joining us today, and hope you have a great rest of the week, and look forward to seeing you again in our December webinar.